welcome back to NostalgiaCast. I'm Darren Lundberg.
And I'm Johnny Craddock.
And today we'll be looking at 1995's Crimson Tide, directed by Tony Scott, starring Denzel Washington, Gene Hackman, or Gene Hackman and Denzel Washington, depending on who you side with in the movie. Again, a very, good, solid blockbuster from the 90s. And we're going to be able to chat with my friend James Coddington, who's probably the leading authority on Tony Scott on Twitter, and somebody I've become very good friends with and had very healthy, fun chats about positivity and being able to focus on, even though we don't think of Tony Scott as one of the greatest directors, like just the way that James has been able to find joy in Tony Scott movies has just been a real, I don't want to say, well, yeah, I'll say it, an inspiration. It's like helped me to like refocus and not be as negative about things. So we'll talk about Crimson Tide, but just really quickly, I wanted to recap because that was such a fun movie to revisit. We talked about The Truman Show last time, right?
Yeah.
Jim Carrey, Peter Weir, Ed Harris. Any follow-up thoughts you had with that, or just kind of summing up the episode?
Yeah, I mean, a quick sum up. We both loved it. I was blown away by it when I first saw it, and the hype was built up, and it delivered on that hype. Usually, when something's built up for me, like it doesn't deliver, but this one did. And like I said in the episode, I just wanted this movie to keep on going. I didn't want it to end, and I had so much fun. Jim Carrey was amazing in it. And yeah, just a great movie. Peter Weir, awesome direction, just really good.
Yeah, just a movie with just something on its mind, even though it maybe didn't know what was going to happen, like with the reality TV boom. Like it's so weird looking back at that movie and seeing how it kind of came before like Survivor and Real Housewives and all these things, and where we became obsessed with celebrity. It's just, yeah, revisiting it again, it's like this is even better than it was last time that I saw it. And last time that I saw it, it was excellent. So, it's just one of those, I said it a couple times, like that's what a masterpiece does. It just keeps getting better and has more meaning. So yeah, definitely go back and listen to that episode. It's funny because a lot of times, like when we started, we're doing all these movies that, are okay. And we have fun with them, like Clash of the Titans, that kind of stuff, Jazz Singer, Goonies, all these things that are fun, but I don't know if they're what I call great movies. So even though we've tackled Back to the Future and It's a Wonderful Life and Princess Bride, it's fun, so fun. It's been so fun just tackling all these movies that are just great. You know what I mean? Instead of trying to, that's why we're kind of kicking the worth remembering, worth a remake kind of thing out. But
Yeah,
yeah, so yeah, any thoughts on that? You're having fun, right?
I'm having a great time. I was going to say, and there's a lot more to come. There's a lot more great movies out there that we want to visit. So we're going to keep this thing going as long as we can.
We could just do countless episodes just on 90s movies. So much great stuff,
Yeah.
right? So, and again, Crimson Tide is definitely one of those, and I want to come back and chat with my friend James about it. But before we do, let's go ahead and watch the trailer.
Okay.
Russian ultra-nationalist leader, backed by his rebel army, threatened nuclear attack on the United States and Japan.
Maybe it's not as bad as it looks. It is.
Those sailors out there are just boys. Boys who are training to do a terrible and unthinkable thing. And if that ever occurs, the only reassurance they'll have that they're doing the proper thing is going to derive from their unqualified belief in the unified chain of command. That means we don't question each other's motives in front of the crew. It means we don't undermine each other. It means they hear your voice right after mine without hesitation. Give him a missile key. Give me the missile key, Mr. Hunter. I I'm the commander of this ship. Give me the key. Millions of lives at stake here if Peter don't make a dumb decision. 1, 2.
Okay, Crimson Tide, 1995, directed by Tony Scott, starring Denzel Washington, Gene Hackman, Denzel Washington, however, whatever your stance is on who's the lead there. Obviously, Tony Scott is big in the 90s, and so I wanted to invite on one of my Twitter friends. He is a Twitter file. He is the titan of all things Tony Scott, Mr. James Coddington. How are you doing?
All right. How are you doing? Thanks for having
me. You're so welcome. So the reason I invited you on is because, again, I would consider you like a fountain of positivity. You don't find that a lot on Twitter. And since you consider yourself like
Thank you.
I think you said Tony Scott is like either Spielberg or Tony Scott is your favorite director. Depends on the day, right?
Yeah, right. Kind of it became like I think, I kind of like, I've been doing the whole Tony Scott thing on Twitter for a while now, and that's was my name for a while. I was just constantly posting Tony Scott stuff, and I'd gone on a friend of mine, Film Feast podcast, and I'd kind of kind of dropped a bombshell or whatever, where I was like, actually Steven Spielberg's actually my favorite director, but I've been running around here, as the Tony Scott guy. But like I said, that's just I'm doing it because I do love Tony Scott, and he is, I kind of said on there too. He's kind of become my favorite in a way. They're both my favorites, and it is one of those things where you can have a different favorite every day. It's like trying to make those kind of thing like lists. Even there's it's impossible. It can be impossible sometimes to really choose whatever you're in the mood for that day. But he's definitely one who I'm going to go back to forever, and I will always revisit. It's always good. He's never lets me down. So
right.
He's up there.
Well, what was it? It was the Domino episode. I think you did kind of blindside Matt and Rosalie with your. He's not actually my favorite. I think they were taking it back a little bit. Yeah, right. So that was fun. Exactly. So, but Johnny, you were saying before you wanted to you had some questions about that little drum set in the background.
Well, yeah, James. When you popped on screen, I did notice there's a drum kit behind you. My first question is, how long have you been playing the drums?
Oh shoot, I can't do math. I got my first set when I was 14.
Okay.
I'm 41. Okay. So, long time.
You don't look a day over 38.
Oh, thanks, buddy.
Now, let me see if I can guess. Is that a Tama? I can't tell by the head.
Oh.
Is that a what kind of kit is that?
Okay, so I got a Tama snare.
Okay.
But the kit is actually Orange County.
Oh, okay. I was going to say it looks different from the Pearl. I have a Pearl. So yeah. Well, are the cymbals Zildjian?
Sabian and Zildjian.
Sabian. Oh, okay, so you got a mix. Okay, cool.
Yes. Yeah.
My next kit is going to be a DW, and I'm going to get Pisces cymbals.
Oh, okay. I've had a few of those in the past, but I usually stick with Sabian, and I have a Zildjian. It's like a China. I think it's an Oriental China is what their little trade or whatever trademark name that I've always stuck with. And then I also have a Zildjian pair of hi-hats, but
see, I've only ever played Zildjian, but I went to a show recently and the drummer had these Pacey cymbals and they sounded so cool. So I was like, you know what? I'm going with Pacey next time. I'm going to try it. Give it a shot.
Yeah. Try it.
This is a fascinating conversation. I'm glad that you guys are able to bond over it.
Yeah. Drums.
So again, what we usually do is this season, since we're doing 90s Palooza, is for the guests that we've had on before, John and I usually give them an option to give us 3 movies to choose from. That way, if we've covered one or if there's something that we don't really want to particularly talk about, we can choose from those 3 that our guest gives about the one we're most excited about. Because this season we don't want to talk about movies that we don't like. We want to talk about movies that we can gush over. And so when I was thinking about, we talked about Tarantino, like Pulp Fiction to open this season and how pervasive Tarantino is. And I was thinking about how, his even screenplays tend to copy him, or he's doing for Crimson Tide, he did some script doctoring and added some things. And so Crimson Tide, I thought Tony Scott, number one, it's weird because it's strange thinking that Tony Scott only made 3 movies during the 80s. Because I think of him as a perennial 80s director. because that's when his style like started to be aped, right? But he's like the 90s, I think, is where he really started like popping and building his career. And so when I thought about that,
what movie was it? Was it Top Gun, Days of Thunder, and what else was in the
no,
80s?
it was The Hunger, right? It was Top Gun, and it was Beverly Hills Cop 2. Those were the
Okay,
three.
that's right.
Yep.
So, and then like
That's
Revenge and Days of Thunder were 1990 to kick off.
both 1990 kicking
Right.
off.
So when I thought about Tony Scott movies and thought, well, what Tony Scott movie would I want to do? And I thought, well, Crimson Tide is my favorite Tony Scott movie. So let's talk about that. And then without even hesitating, I was like, if we were to get a guest for Crimson Tide, there's only one person on this planet that I would think of. And that was you. Because again, you're known as that Tony Scott guy, or you have been before you changed it to the Great Spielbergo, or what are you
right? Yeah, and I still got Tony Scott in there because that's
AKA.
never going to go away.
Right. So,
stay.
But again, with Crimson Tide, I thought there's no better person to come on and talk about Tony Scott than James, and so that's why we invited you on. So we definitely want to talk about that, and we want to talk about our histories with Crimson Tide and mostly the movie itself. But if you could, I asked you to do some homework, like for again, another reason we invited you on. When Johnny and I covered Labyrinth as one of our first episodes, like we had a lot of requests for that one. But Johnny and I were like, we don't really like Labyrinth, but we didn't want to badmouth it. So we brought on Johnny's wife, Ruth, who's an author and a Brian Froud fan. Mm-hmm. We invited her on to kind of give us the boost so we can have a good conversation instead of just badmouthing. And even though I like Tony Scott, I'm not as down on Tony Scott as I was on Labyrinth. I just thought that we need somebody on that could give us, like, because people are going to critique Tony Scott. A lot of people have criticisms of him. Johnny and I have criticisms of him, but we want somebody on.
I have criticisms of him.
Yeah, there you go. But we did want somebody that could be positive and give us kind of the all around scope of why he means so much. And so I asked you for a little homework. If you could give us a little rundown of Tony Scott, why he matters to you and how he came to be so prolific and well known over that 80s, 90s, 2000s period.
Yeah. I mean, it wasn't much homework. I'm not going to lie. It was kind of all already in there.
I figured.
So I didn't have to do much.
Right.
I was like, okay, I got that. But yeah, I mean, no, like you already went over his 80s, right? Only 3. That's when he started. He started with The Hunger. That's the one a lot of people kind of think of as like, it's more arty. He even says it kind of, it's, he's got a funny clip I've posted probably 1 million times on Twitter where he talks about it being an arty, esoteric, up its own ass type of movie. But, people call it like a commercial because he had come from commercial, obviously. And so it had a lot of those stylings too, like all the flowing drapes, and it even starts with the Bauhaus, at the intro of the movie, kind of cross-cutting back and forth between that and also I'm spending too much time on one movie already. Okay, sorry. So yeah, that's the beginning. Hunger, we got Top Gun, Beverly Hills Cop 3, that's the 80s. But so where I started with him is Top Gun. My mom was a huge Tom Cruise fan, actually. Mm-hmm. So Top Gun was kind of like a staple in our house growing up. So it was on all the time. And that's where I knew his name because, saw Tony Scott's name on there. Then Days of Thunder became another, household on all the time. Tom Cruise, like I said, my mom was kind of obsessed with Tom Cruise for a while there. And that one was on all the time. So Tony Scott was already kind of just getting ingrained in me without me even kind of realizing it at the time.
Yeah.
And then that just kind of blossomed into what it is now because I came back to him so much later in life now, in my late 30s, early 40s, and realized, once I got into film later in my life, and you start like learning about, oh, this is who directed this is who did that, this is the cinema, and we start geeking out about all those things and learning who's doing what, and you realize, oh, Tony Scott made all these movies I like, I didn't even know it. I thought it was Top Gun and Days of Thunder, but no, it's everything, so that's how I got into him. But as far as his career, I would say he does kind of have like 3 distinct periods, which is the 80s, the 90s, and the aughts. But it worked out perfectly that way for him somehow. But if you think about it, and even looking at it stylistically, Top Gun, action blockbuster, that's kind of starts that in the 80s, and then he continues it with Beverly Hills Cop 2. And then continues at the early 90s. It kind of goes off a little with Revenge, but Days of Thunder also, a lot of people call it, Top Gun, NASCAR Top Gun, whatever. But
right,
I like it a little more than that. It's actually my favorite Tony Scott movie. We'll say
Okay.
favorite. It doesn't mean it's technically the best. It's one of those things, we won't get into that, but
Well,
it's
that
the one.
answers my questions because I see the Last Boy Scout poster behind you. So
Yeah.
I almost figured that I might be your favorite Tony Scott film, but now that you answered,
No,
I don't have to ask it.
yeah, exactly. No, it's actually, yes. Sorry, I might have jumped the gun there. Yeah, it's Days of Thunder is my favorite. I mean, again, they're all great, but in the 90s, he kind of does get a little more streamlined. Like you were kind of said it earlier in the intro, Crimson Tide, you said it's your favorite. It's probably his most smooth, precise. It's just it's kind of like what you think of when you think of an action blockbuster of the 90s. Almost like it's got everything you want. It's stylistically great, but it's also got all these great performances and everything on top of it. Great story.
Yeah,
it's just a straightforward, great movie all the way through. Nothing too showy, which that's where I would say his last half of his career kind of went into, where it got more style over substance. Not that there wasn't substance, right? I mean, you think of something like Man on Fire, Deja Vu. These are deep movies that have a lot, going on in them, but you do get those visuals and that style first. Like, I mean, that's what you see. You see all that crazy camera work. You see all the crazy editing. You see all the strange techniques he's using, and like it became kind of what people now associate with him, I think, more so than anything previously. It's kind of that Man on Fire, Deja Vu, all those the crazy colors, all that. That's kind of like, I feel like nowadays you say Tony Scott, that's going to pop in your head. But
yeah,
that's it. I mean, there's a lot more, but I don't know. We could go.
Right.
We could do a whole episode just about like his career and like where he started. Because
yeah,
I mean that was another thing. He's a painter. Like he's got his master's in fine arts. But as he started painting background, so like he did all his own storyboards and stuff like that. Like he had a lot of stuff. Wait, what can I say?
yeah.
All around
Well,
cool guy.
it's a lot like his brother Ridley, right? I mean, very
Yes.
stylistic. They started making commercials, music videos, stuff like that, and that's the kind of the MTV aesthetic that they kind of adopted. And why, when I say like it's weird, because I think of him as an 80s director, I think just Top Gun was so influential, just the way it was, the MTV style editing, the quick cuts, you could call Top Gun like a shallow movie, right? Because it's all about the style, even though, you could look at it's about like masculinity. It's about a look at like how far we'll go, like to prove ourselves. So there is depth to his movies. It's just, it's not as like Ridley Scott. I think he's stylistic, but he has a way of he's slower. Obviously, he's more deliberate as a filmmaker. So you notice the meaning, right? I think a lot of time, like one of the criticisms of Tony Scott is like the style kind of overtakes that substance more than being style over substance. But it's like, it's the editing and the fast cuts. It's kind of a distraction. It distracts you from the meaning that kind of shows up there.
Yeah,
so
it can definitely.
Yeah, and that's definitely, and any, like I said, any filmmaker is going to have kind of detractors there. So just briefly, like, and then I'll ask Johnny too about what his experience with Tony Scott is. But Tony Scott, for me, I think it did start with Top Gun, because that was the movie. I said this on Twitter before. That was the movie where my mom first made me uncomfortable, because during the volleyball scene where Rick Rossovich is doing that little flex, we watched in the theater. My mom went woo, like out loud, and I was like, Mom. So that was kind of the defining moment for him. But it was one of those things where, well, this guy is going to be big. And then Beverly Hills Cop 2 obviously hit big. Days of Thunder, I think I saw in the theater. Last Boy Scout I saw in the theater. True Romance I saw in the theater. Crimson Tide. And so Tony Scott has been a part of my film going life. It's not as deep. Like, I don't think that he's made a Blade Runner. I don't think that he's made an Alien. So he's not quite as indelible as his brother, I don't think. But he's made a stamp, definitely. Like, as far as entertainment goes, I think.
Sure.
Well, I'll give you my opinion on why everybody kind of knocks on Tony Scott. But Johnny, what is your history with Tony Scott? How did you get introduced to him? What do you think of him now? All that.
Well, I don't think I really knew much about him until I saw True Romance with you. And then I think you and I saw Crimson Tide in the theater together, right?
Yep.
Like,
most likely.
I remember that. But it wasn't until then that I started doing any research on him. But I always liked him. Like, I went back and watched his older movies, and I liked those. And then I mean, recently I enjoy the movies he's made. I enjoy the Spy Games and what else? Domino. What else was there that he made that? Picking Up Pelham 1,
recently?
2. Yeah, I mean, just
Unstoppable.
Yeah. They're entertaining. They're fun to watch. They're action packed. They keep you on the edge of your seat. I mean, I just watched Crimson Tide for this, and I was like actually surprised at how on edge I was almost the entire time. Like it just kept me engaged from start to finish, and I was like, wow, I forgot how good this movie is. Like I know I
Yeah.
always liked it, but it was like this was really intense. Like,
Yeah,
it
yeah.
was really well made, and so I always really appreciated Tony Scott.
So this is what I tend to think of Tony Scott. Like critics kind of thumb their nose at this kind of thing, right? I mean, they tend to rail against films that are made surely, critics we're talking about. They
Yeah.
rail against movies that are made surely for entertainment purposes, or worse, movies that are made surely for entertainment purposes in a style that's populist or in like the fad of the time. Like I think
Right.
critics kind of turn their nose up on that. That's the way that people react to his movies in a nutshell. I think critics are kind of, because he makes movies for audiences and audience sensibilities. A lot of critics look at that and they're like, this is not for me. Like I'm above this sort of thing. Like why aren't you appealing to my sensibilities, like the instead of the rabble, right? But I think that is a strength. If a movie like Owen Gleiberman, when after Tony Scott committed suicide, he did an Entertainment Weekly. He did like a retrospective on him, and he said that look, Top Gun, when I first saw it, he says when he first saw Top Gun, it was like shallow and it was like a Reaganite, like a movie, and it was trying to push all these buttons. But then when he went back and he saw it like years later, it was like this movie accomplishes what it needs to accomplish, and in that, it's a good movie. Like it gets you high on the sensation of being a fighter pilot, right? And that's a good movie if it accomplishes what it needs to do. And I think Tony Scott, I don't know if both of you agree, I think he has that sensibility that he, and it doesn't always hit. Like he has his hits, he has his misses, but he's definitely more of an audience attuned director. James, would you agree with that?
Yes. And I'd also add probably that, like you were saying that, sometimes critics get overly sensitive about like, excuse me, when you are following a fad or like like you were saying, populist. But I think part of what helped Tony Scott was that he was kind of creating some of those himself. Yeah. Like he was making some of those populist things the populist thing before it kind of became the populist thing.
Right.
And so it's almost like, well, you got to give him a little more credit than maybe everyone else, right? Like, I mean, Michael Bay was, kind of following in his Tony Scott's footsteps more so, right? And like, sure, everyone dogged on Michael Bay and still does, today, but it's like that's because Tony Scott kind of was starting all these little new fads and then would kind of build on them a little bit each movie as he was going on, as you can even see it chronologically as his career goes on. He's just building on all these little techniques and adding new things. And I don't know, to me that's a good thing, right? I mean, you're doing something new and it becomes popular because it's cool or, quote unquote cool. Yeah. And that turns off some critics, I guess, and that's just the way it is, like you said.
Yeah. Johnny, what do you think about the way critics look at Tony Scott? Did you have any thoughts on that?
I don't know. I don't really care much what critics think.
Good.
Me either.
And that's why Tony Scott works for you, right?
Yeah. Exactly.
I like it. If I don't, I don't. I thought of one I like though. Enemy of the State. That's one of my favorite Tony Scott movies. I think it's so well done and it's so interesting the way it's put together.
Well, more James, Hackman. Yeah, absolutely. Or as like a kind of a semi-sequel to The Conversation. I like that that the Enemy of the State kind of functions like that. But it's really interesting because James, like you and Matt on Film Feast, you talked about how if you watch Top Gun and then you watch Unstoppable, a part of you is like, this is not the same filmmaker, right? And I think that's the sign of a good filmmaker is that he's always like evolving his style, even if it doesn't work. I know that again, during your Domino episode, you were big celebrators of that movie, and even though I've come to appreciate that movie a little bit more because it's in the headspace of Domino Harvey, you know what I mean? And that's the whole point of the movie. But it's like from minute 1 to minute 127, it's on like 11. Mescaline. It's on 11. Right. And so even though I understand the point of the movie, by the end, I'm like exhausted. My eyes are exhausted. My body's exhausted just because it's that way from frame 1. And even though I appreciate the movie, it's not something that I can watch. But even again and again, but even then, he was trying something. You know what I mean? He was trying to be in that headspace. So it's interesting to look at it that way, whether you reject it or not. And even he says he kind of screwed that one up, right? He really tried. He really liked that story, and then he thinks that he went overboard with it. And I think that's why he kind of calmed down and eventually got to Deja Vu and Unstoppable and Taking a Pelham 1, 2, 3, which might be one of his calmest movies, even though it's a lot more energetic than the original. But it's all about evolving his style, and I think that's really interesting. I mean, did you have any other? I don't want to repeat like full stop what stuff that you talked about with Matt, but do you have any other thoughts about that?
Yeah, no, I mean, you're right. It is. And like you said, I kind of did mention that even on that, podcast, that you don't have to enjoy it or like even like it that much, or like it can be too much. Obviously, like there's no question it can be too much for certain, people to watch. Like you said, it just wears you out. Like you can't even handle it by the end you're drained. And that can turn a lot of people off. But, the technical side is, like you said, it's pushing it so far, trying so many new things that it's like I can appreciate that so much, and that appreciation can kind of just go into my viewing of the movie. Like I'm like, oh, this is so cool what he's doing, and it kind of translates into my enjoyment of the movie. But it doesn't work that way for everyone, and I can't expect it to, right? Like you said, it can still be overload for other people, and they can maybe appreciate it, but they're still like, but it's still detracting from the story. Like you said, Tony Scott, even too much. Maybe I should have reeled it in a little bit,
Yeah.
To let people kind of get what's going on. But hey,
right. But even then, I think Domino is still more interesting than the latest, like what Michael Bay movie. It's weird because Michael Bay, obviously, when you compare scenes of Tony Scott movies to Michael Bay movies, and then you compare it to like Simon West movies, it's like it's a copy of a copy of a copy. So it starts getting diluted a little bit. So even though Michael Bay has a definite style, I don't think there's as much purpose to his style as Tony Scott has. Like he says again and again, he tries to get in the headspace. He tries to let the style be dictated by the substance, by the character.
Sure.
Right. And that
I will say I do like Michael Bay a lot.
Yeah, and Michael Bay has his positives, has his detractors. I know Christopher Nolan is a big fan of Michael Bay, and so that's Steven Spielberg is a big fan of Michael Bay, obviously. So there's a definite audience for that. It's just interesting. I mean, what is your history with Crimson Tide? If you want to give us a little brief rundown of the movie, like where you saw it, what you thought of it, all
that. It's one I saw on video. I didn't see many Tony Scott movies in the theater, unfortunately. So most of them are all rentals, VHS, DVD, Blu-ray. Crimson Tide was a VHS. I saw it back in the day on VHS, and I never owned it or anything, but it was just a movie that I knew. Oh, I like this movie. This is a good movie, but it wasn't one that I was like attached to in any way when I did see it originally. It's funny that I say Days of Thunder is my favorite Tony Scott movie, but I will probably say that Crimson Tide is his best, maybe most complete film, like in my opinion. So it's like my favorite, but not my favorite. If that makes sense. But yeah, but it's one that like I've just come around to more in later years. I can throw it on. It's funny because you wouldn't think that it would make a good background movie because it is so like dialogue and like verbal sparring, but I can throw it on and just be listening to. I don't even have to see it because I can see it in my mind. I can, I know what's going on there in this stuff. I can just hear this dialogue going on and this banter back and forth and they're sparring, and it's just like, that's good. It's music to my ears. So it makes it great. I throw it on if I'm working. Listen to some Crimson Tide.
That makes sense. Johnny, what about you? What's your experience with the movie? We obviously, you said, I think we saw it in the theater together, but what your main impressions?
I remember being really impressed by it. See, I've also had kind of like an affinity for like wartime movies. Like, we talked about Taps before, talked about A Few Good Men, Crimson Tide. I've never been in the military, but I really like military movies. I don't know what it is about them. I like just watching that world and seeing, how they are and like the structure of it and chain of command, all that stuff. It kind of appeals to me because I'm kind of structured and organized in my daily life. So to see it on screen is like kind of like, it appeals to me in some way. But anyway, I used to put it on at night and fall asleep to it. So I understand that whole listening to it while you're just kind of in the background noise. I used to put it on and fall asleep to Denzel Washington and Gene Hackman yelling at each other.
Yeah, it's weird.
Yeah,
it's soothing in a strange way. Like
I know, right?
It's hard to explain.
But as far as like military movies or Tony Scott movies, I think it's up there as one of the best ones.
Well, it's
Agreed.
interesting you talk about it as kind of a comfort, because I think, especially, we're talking about Tony Scott, especially with Top Gun Maverick making the impression that it did. I think Top Gun Maverick works because it's good old fashioned filmmaking, and even though we can praise Michael Bay in certain ways, there is something different about that style versus a Top Gun Maverick style where it's more classical and it's more I don't you can, like I said, you can fall asleep to it just because it's a comfort, right? And I think when we talk about falling asleep to Gene Hackman and Denzel Washington yelling at each other, it's more that I can understand what you're saying, because it just, when I was watching it today, it just felt like, um, I don't know, it just felt like two old masters, like showing us the craft and how the craft should be done. And so it's, speaking of Tony Scott being a painter, it's like watching an artist paint. It's like it's comforting and you can fall asleep to it, right? And I think that's, I don't know, is that kind of what you guys mean by having it on as a background movie?
Yeah, that sounds about right.
Okay, like watching an old Bob Ross episode.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah,
Sleep to
it. Which makes no sense, but somehow it does.
Somehow it does. Happy little memories.
Yep.
I mean, yeah, I would definitely say I think it's a masterclass in acting. I mean, Denzel Washington and Gene Hackman, they're at their finest in this movie. You can't really do any better than these two together on screen. You love to hate Gene Hackman, and you love to root for Denzel Washington in this movie, and they both just give you that, like, I don't know. There's that tension that's built from the very beginning. During that little interview, there's already that tension that's built, and it just kind of like escalates throughout the entire movie. And the way they pull it off together on screen, it's just, I think it's phenomenal. Really well done.
Yeah, when we saw it in the theater, my main takeaway from watching it in '95 was the acting was great. Like, that's the main thing that I focused on. I wasn't really, because we talked about it before, my whole summer that year was Batman Forever. And so I was kind of addicted to that. And so everything else kind of paled in comparison, which is weird because nowadays everything's flip-flopped, right? Mm-hmm. Watching Crimson Tide today, I was just so impressed, Johnny, like you said, about how the tension is just ratcheted from the beginning. And then watching it like one scene after another. So you go from their first meeting or whatever, but then you have their dinner scene. And so first of all, the thing, my first note of the movie is, yeah, we can look at Top Gun or The Hunger, we can look at Unstoppable, and they look like movies from different filmmakers. But to me, I can still look like there's a shot of a birthday party in Crimson Tide that starts it, right? And I was like, this is a Tony Scott movie. Like, I could just tell just from the framing and just from the shadows and just from the sumptuous like backgrounds. Like his movies are never boring. Even if the movies themselves, like the content is boring, the look of them is never dull or stale because it's so packed with detail and it's so packed with dynamism, and there's just so much going on. The scene where they're, Ramsey's giving his speech in the rain. It's obviously rain. It's like very atmospheric, and they're always like that. But again, what I thought was great was, number one, the tension of that scene. I think it was written by, I know Michael Schiffer is the credited screenwriter, and that's when he came up with the idea. But they did turn to Tarantino. They did turn to Robert Towne. I think Steven Zaillian wrote a couple scenes. But the Robert Towne scene where they're all at dinner and they're name dropping things like Patton and communism and Nagasaki and all these things. And right from the start, you can tell that they're talking about ideas, right? This is not just a sensation movie. They're actually talking about what this means. And what I thought was great is it's kind of like politics, right? You have whatever side that you're on, people are just yelling at walls. It's not really, you're not getting to the meat of what a person thinks. It's just, oh, you're on this side. Oh, obviously I hate you because I'm on this side. And that's what it seems like when Ramsey questions Hunter about what you think war is, and he says, well, the true enemy of war is war itself, right? And you can tell Gandolfini and Matt Kramer, they're all looking whenever Ramsey or Hackman asks these questions, and whatever Hunter says, you can tell that it's not jibing. They know that it's not jibing with what their captain thinks, right? And so
they're waiting for his reaction to everything that Denzel says.
And so that tension is built from the beginning. But the thing that I noticed, and the reason why Crimson Tide is my favorite Tony Scott movie is, we can talk about the style and how sometimes it feeds into the substance or overwhelms it. But notice during that scene, it's all normal shots. There's nothing fancy. Like if you compare it to Man on Fire, if there's a scene of Denzel Washington talking to somebody, all of a sudden there's text that pops up randomly. and there's different like elliptical cuts and things like that as they're just having a regular conversation. And then, to me, that's a distraction from what's actually happening in the scene. My brain is like, well, what does this have to do? And so I'm thinking, and I'm not really getting the gist of the scene, which to me in Man of Fire is even though I think it's a strong movie in total, I think that's the weakness of it, because the style kind of overtakes, it takes me out of the moment a lot of the time. We can come back to that. But with this, when they're talking about ideas during that dinner scene, it's masterful because it's the screenplay is ratcheting up, the performances are ratcheting up that tension, but Scott never overwhelms the function of the scene. You know what I mean? It's never overdone to the point where you're distracted about it because you're just focused on their words. I mean, what did you guys think of that? The dinner scene in total, James. What did you think?
Yeah, well, you kind of mentioned it earlier. You know, he's doing what he needs to do. He's using classical film technique, right? I mean, simple cuts back and forth, character reaction, like you're not overloading, like you said, so you're able to really appreciate exactly, you know, all the reactions on everyone's face during this dialogue back and forth between Hackman and Washington, which is what you need to do.
Yeah,
you don't want to be distracted by anything else. And you know, you said you come back to Man on Fire. That can be distracting, right? Like having all that text pop up, because then you're like, oh, what's going on behind that text? You know, now I'm missing what Denzel's face is doing, right? You might even those 2 seconds. I can understand you might miss you might miss that one little facial tick that made the scene, right? Because now you're looking at what text just scrolled across the screen. None of that in Crimson Tide. Not that it doesn't bother me as much in Man on Fire. I'm not trying to say that, sorry, but yeah, like it is. Like you said, it's just perfect kind of blocking all the, you know, that's another thing, kind of like his framing it. I've been watching a lot of Spielberg recently. I've been going through his filmography again, and that's just one of those
classical
things,
right?
Yeah, and you just, you know, like it's just, it kind of gets insane how you're like every single shot is perfect, right? Like, I mean, there's not a character out of place. Everyone's exactly where you can see every single person. And you kind of forget that that's what you know, that's how you make movies, quote unquote, you know. And so many people kind of forget that there's just these, yeah, sure, there are rules and you can break them and whatever, and that's always good. And if you do it creatively and whatnot, that makes a good movie too. But when they hit and they work and you see it, like someone who is able to have such control of that, and it's just, man, it's something special, right? I mean, and that's kind of what that whole scene is in Crimson Tide.
Yeah. What did I have here? I wrote that the dinner scene, it's like it's about actual ideas. It lays the groundwork for everybody's political stance, and it also sets everyone at odds with each other. That's what kind of sets it up. And then you move, like you see the next, we're speaking of tension, right? And if you look at scene by scene, there's the fire that breaks out in the galley. And then Ramsey decides to run that drill. Mm-hmm. And then the cook dies. And then they confront each other. They have that conversation in the captain's quarters, right? And even though Hunter is giving his ideas and his POV, like he backs down on that. And then it shows the montage of him obviously working out and boxing and doing the jump to kind of relax and kind of de-stress. And then he goes to see Weps, or Peter, like he calls him Weps. I think that's interesting. That's his title, right, on the boat. But he goes to see, and then there's a friction there because Weps is like, well, it's not the captain's fault that the guy died. Like you have to back up. You have to know what this guy like understand. And so there's that friction there. And again, Hunter backs off and he jokes around with them. And then there's the next scene where, you know, the Tarantino influence where they talk about the Silver Surfer. And it kind of adds the relief of tension. But then he goes and he thinks he's getting along with Ramsey, and he goes and talks to him. And then Ramsey he announces on the bullhorn or whatever and says, you know, you guys need to suck it up, right? There's if you're stressed out, that's your fault. Like, we're in war, damn it. Like, buck up and be a man about it. And so that adds more stress. And then it comes to the part where the EAM, the actual EAM comes in, and then there's the Akula that they're fighting with. And then it comes to a boil where finally, you know, Ramsey tells Hunter to shut the hell up, right? But I made this decision, right? Shut up. And Hunter's done, right? And so that's your first pushback of the movie, where that's your first relief, where he gets the upper hand, right? But even after that, after they put Ramsey in his quarters, then there's the Akula attack. And so it never stops. Like, it just keeps ramping and ramping and ramping. And I just thought, from a, you know, here's the thing is that, and I'm talking way too much about this, but
nope,
anybody could direct this script and it would still be strong. right? But I think Tony Scott adds a stylization. And if we're talking, the last thing I'll talk about his style, how it adds to the substance this time, is you have the really oppressive greens. You have the really oppressive reds, the really oppressive blues that are on everybody's faces. Everybody's sweating all the time. There's always these digital readouts that are reflecting on people's faces. It's like they shot the movie on a gimbal, right, to be in a submarine. So sometimes it tilts to give you the impression that the submarine is kind of tilting on its side. But even when it's not, the Dutch angles, which in a lesser movie and on a lesser director's hands would detract from it, but that adds to the tension because everything is kind of lopsided, right? And so I think that the colors add to the claustrophobia of what it's like to be on that submarine. The sweat kind of adds to it, and the obviously the screenplay and everything. It's just I'd agree. It's Scott's most classically made movie, and that's why I was just adoring the filmmaking. I was never detracted by the style, and I'm guessing that's how you guys feel. Johnny, is that how was there a style that kind of overwhelmed them, or did you notice any of that?
Well, yeah, I definitely noticed the style, and like you mentioned, the Dutch angles. But I do want to go back to that dinner scene because you were talking about it. And the one thing that I want to say is that he only shot it what it was supposed to be, what the scene called for. And
yeah.
Being a musician and a songwriter, like being in bands, when we would write songs, I never wanted to overplay on the drums. I never wanted to do like something too flashy that wasn't supposed to be there. If it called for it, I did it, and if it didn't, then I didn't do it. And so having that background, and also being in film for a few years, it's important to do what the scene calls for. The scene is the king, so let the scene dictate how you shoot it. If it requires shaky cam or handheld stuff, then use that to your advantage. If it doesn't, then don't. Use it to what's going to best enhance the scene. So I think that's what Tony Scott did in that scene and throughout the entire movie. So as attention builds, so does the stylistic filmmaking, and also builds.
Yeah, James, you described the movie as kind of an action blockbuster, and it's weird because there's no, like, other than that one submarine fight, right? There's not a lot of action, but it feels like an action movie because there's so much tension, and I think the acting and the script and the style, it just, I don't know, man. Like it all works.
Crazy.
Yeah, it works together as opposed to like the style being the only thing you notice. And there's so Top Gun, like there's a style, and it's crazy, man, that was his second movie. Like he already had a style. Like it seemed, and when I was reading, I was like, that's his second movie. It feels like his seventh. Like it feels like he's already got this nailed down. But even watching that, the style and the music, the songs and the editing, it kind of that's the point of the movie. It seems like the sensation. And here it's everything. It just seems like I said, the acting, the script, the style, it's all giving you an impression of what you're supposed to be feeling scene by scene by scene. And it's so great.
Dariusz Wolski's cinematographer on this.
Yeah.
Great, right? And like he only did 2 movies with him, this one and The Fan, and they're 2 of his best looking movies he got to do with the cinematographer.
Yeah.
But lots of close-ups on the faces, they're all sweaty, like you're always in there with them, and you're always feeling everything that they're feeling, and being able to show that is important, and he did it perfectly.
Yeah. So Johnny, I wanted to ask you if you had any other ideas on the acting, but one of the notes that I did, I like that this movie is loaded with people that I knew. It's like, oh, Viggo Mortensen, I wrote this down. Oh, Ricky Schroeder. Oh, Steve Zahn. Like, oh, there's Ryan Phillippe. I was like, what is that? James Gandolfini.
Right.
Johnny, did you want to add anything else to the Hackman-Washington dynamic?
Well, I think I mentioned it already. Just I thought how great they were. You can't do any better than those 2 in this movie with this script. They just play it so well. They know their characters backwards and forwards. The chemistry is there. The timing is there. All the pauses and just by the way, that delivery when Gene Hackman finally loses it and blows at him, I have to laugh at that every time he does that. Like, because you feel that tension building, and I've had those situations where I've had someone I'm talking to, and you're trying to stay calm, and you can't stay calm, and then finally you lose it. So I know what that's like. And so when he finally says, "Shut the F up," it's just so funny. But anyway,
real.
I did want to point out that I thought Rick Shorter did an awesome job in trying to close the hatch scene. Honestly, he was so good in that scene.
Bill just sealed, sir, and he has that obvious contempt in his voice.
Yeah.
That was great.
I almost want to see more of Rick Schroeder in movies. I don't see him very much.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
No, you go ahead. That's great.
I was just gonna say, like, just thinking about, like, I rewatch. I've even got it on in the background right now. Just and it's rewatching movies over and over. That's the thing I've been doing a lot too over these last few years. I've realized that, man, I like revisiting my favorites. Like I'm trying to like lessen my load of like feeling like I have to watch every new movie right when it comes out, and it's like, you know, you're feeling like, oh, I got to catch up. Oh, I missed this, I missed that. But I like revisiting all my movies, and one thing I notice is as I'm revisiting so many times, like I'm noticing new things, like little thing here, little thing there, and like couple things I noticed today whenever I was watching this. Like you were talking about the scene whenever is it after the dinner scene? Oh gosh, when was it? After he does the fire drill and the guy ends up dying.
Yeah.
And then Hunter comes up to Ramsey and like, confronts him a little bit about it. But they're kind of just going back and forth while Ramsey's trying to talk on the mic, and he's like, "Now it's not the time." Little moment, like just kind of says it to him under his breath. I mean, it's a small, tiny thing, but like I noticed it. Like
Even
now's not time.
the
Perfect. Like
little
it's just
looks,
a little addition.
the little looks that they give to each other too. Like
Mm-hmm.
see that like contempt and those little
Like
looks.
daggers. I wrote that.
Yeah,
These
yeah.
daggers.
Even
Yeah.
that is just so well done.
Yeah. And then another thing that I noticed was like, I mean, it was just kind of like an idea. I was like, as soon as the first mutiny happens and Ramsey gets locked up in his quarters, he starts looking at Hunter's file, and I'm like, it's almost like he's already kind of treating him like he's studying his enemy. Like, what do I got on this guy? Like, now he's the bad guy. It's good stuff, man. Good stuff.
Well, before the last topic I wanted to kind of cover before we dive, I wanted to dive a little bit deeper into the meaning of the movie and why it actually hit so hard. But the last thing I wanted to talk about then is the Tarantinoisms that are in this movie. The other thing I wanted to add when I first saw this in the movie is I think before Pulp Fiction, unless it was a movie about Hollywood itself, unless it was a Sunset Boulevard, or unless it was The Player, like Robert Altman, unless it was one of those movies never seemed to talk about other movies. I never noticed them doing that. And then as soon as Pulp Fiction hit, all of a sudden everybody became hyper aware of like breaking that fourth wall or all these different. And so at the beginning, when it's Gandolfini and Mortensen talking about Run Silent, Run Deep and The Enemy Below, they're naming off submarine movies. Right. And they're name dropping these movies. And I remember sitting in the theater going, what's happening? Like, why are they talking about other movies? Like, why aren't they just talking? They're not talking about the situation. They're talking and having a conversation like all of us would have, like mentioning different things, right? There's the Mobius versus the Kirby Silver Surfer conversation. It reminded me of True Romance when Clarence brings Alabama back to his comic shop, and there's a whole scene where he's talking to her about comic books and how she's falling in love with him. There, it's like movies don't do that. The Star Trek Scotty conversation that he has with Vossler, I thought was really funny. It's like, I know that's a shitty deal, but that's so funny. But even though that Tarantinoism is there, I thought it was great in this because it kept lightening that tension. Whenever there was tension, there was that Silver Surfer thing that come up. There was that Star Trek thing that come up. At the end was like, this is Captain Kirk. I need you to hit light speed. And so it has that double-edged meaning of, being a Tarantinoism, but it's also a mood lightener. It's also part of the fabric of the movie. Was I don't know, would you guys agree with that? I'll ask you first, James. Like Tarantinoisms, is that something you notice as well, or a trend that you felt?
Yeah, it seems like yeah, it is kind of funny because like, rewatching it nowadays, you don't even think about it. You're just, because you're used to it, like you said. Yeah. I can't imagine. I don't remember watching it then and thinking about it then, even. But I could see how you would have that. Like, what's going on here? That's weird. They're actually talking about real life things in our movies, like that are real. They're not just they're talking about fake movies in their own world, right? Like this is like, now it's becoming even some weird extra meta whatever, like universe. So yeah, I could see how that is definitely a Tarantinoism for sure too.
Yeah, but Johnny, the Tarantinoisms for you, Johnny, was that a plus or a minus of the movie?
It's a plus. I think it definitely brings a human element into it. It makes these characters relatable when they talk about normal everyday things like movies and comic books. And I think it also lightens the tension, like you mentioned, because it's such a tense movie and all this stuff. It's so critical that they do their jobs perfectly. When you have these moments where you can talk about something like that and have a little bit of a comic relief, it does kind of lighten the load and kind of makes things a little more, and just makes it fun for a brief moment while they're in this, tense situation. But I think it's critical that it's there. I can't imagine it not being there.
Yeah.
It
Well, I
matches
guess,
Washington's character too. I mean,
yeah,
it really, because he does want to, he, like Ramsey mentions how he's like in tune with these guys, right? Like when he's even talking about, like you talked about, when he goes over the loudspeaker and instead of like saying anything motivating or whatever, he's like, "Hey guys, get your butt in gear," right?
yeah,
But
yeah.
Denzel's like opposite, right? So he's like, he's going to lighten their load a little bit because he knows that's actually what they need, not the kick in the butt, So
Yeah.
it makes
Right.
sense.
Well, the movie again, it's about again, what did I have here? It's about contingency leadership versus situational leadership, right? You have the Ramsey character who is very like stalwart. He has the military experience. He's had experienced action before. Like he knows that you have to make decisions. And Hunter's more diplomatic. He's more like, let's think about this. Let's not really. And so those ideals, they clash, right? And the thing that I love about this movie, we talk about it having the feel of an action movie, but it's a movie. When you say action movies, it kind of limits you, like to what the movie is trying to accomplish. It's just the sensation for sensation's sake. But this movie is about ideas. There's so many conversations. The dinner scene, or when he's talking with Weps in their room together, or when it's the scene where before the blow up, Johnny, where Ramsey's like, we don't have rules that open to interpretation, personal intuition, like gut feelings, hairs in the back of your neck. Even those things are kind of like about ideas. When the mutiny on top of the mutiny like sticks Hunter in the mess hall, and he's talking with chief of the boat, and he's talking about like what orders mean, like he could be wrong, like what, like we have a responsibility. And so it's constantly again, the thing that was so impressive it never ever relaxes. The whole movie is about it's constantly asking us in the audience what to think about. To think, it's asking us to ponder about things that are happening, right? And that's so impressive to me, where even at the end, like as soon as the tension is built and it builds to a climax, and again, as soon as I like that when you find out, spoilers, that there isn't going to be a nuclear war, right? And Ramsey realizes that it could have gone too far, and he gives control of the boat back to Hunter, like back to being rational and objective. I like that move.
Mm-hmm.
But you notice too, as soon as he does that, that the oppressive colors, they stop, and it's back to classical because the tension is done, right?
Mm-hmm.
But even then, it cuts to the tribunal with Jason Robards, and it's about ideas. How it's like you both were right, but you were both wrong. And the question I wanted to ask you here is what I think is so interesting. And there's different tiers we can attack this from. But I guess the first tier is, if the movie, because we start the movie out seeing Hunter's side, he's got a family, right? We know where he's oriented from. And then we're introduced to Ramsey at his desk, and we're already on edge, right? So we're on Hunter's side. Visually, the movie and narratively, the movie is getting us on Hunter's side because he's the first character we become familiar with. And then Ramsey comes in, he's kind of this hard ass that kind of butts up against that. James, what do you think would have happened if they switched it and showed it from Ramsey's point of view from the beginning about how he became this way? And then it's Hunter coming in and kind of, you know, ruining his destabilizing him. And how do you think the movie would have changed if it was from that perspective?
I don't know. It's hard to say because I think it would probably change based on who's watching it, maybe more so than anything. Like, because I think the viewer's going to bring their own ideals into it. So, you're saying you're on Hunter's side. Well, someone might watch it and not be on Hunter's side, even though maybe we are. But so it's tough to say because I don't want to guess on what isn't there, right? Like it's real tough to say. But for me, I feel like it wouldn't change too much because the movie does such a good job. What the writing does such a good job of putting those ideals. So like, yes, you see the home life of Hunter at the beginning, and you see this personality of Ramsey right at the beginning. As soon as he's at his desk and they meet. But I think even if you got it swapped, once if the movie in the middle stays the same and you're getting those ideals clashing and they're both, like I said, both right, both wrong, I think it would almost possibly end the same.
Yeah, that's definitely like the meat of that conversation, right? I mean, does that make sense? What I'm saying is like it's all about perspective, like you just mentioned,
Mm-hmm.
right? I mean, Johnny, what do you think about that? If it had been switched and it's all a matter of visual stakes, and you said yourself that you side with Washington, you're against Hackman, is because we kind of have this ingrained. But the Robards character at the end says you're both right, you're both wrong. You can see both sides of where they're coming from. I mean, what do you think?
Yeah. That's interesting. I never really thought about that, but I do think it would have helped the movie had we maybe seen a little more backstory with Gene Hackman. Because I know we made him right at the interview scene, but you know he had his wife died, and he only has the dog now, and then that's all he has anymore. So you might find a little more empathy for him, for that character, if you got to know him a little more. So
Yeah.
that might have helped, but I still think it works the way it is now. But I never really thought about seeing Hackman's character first. I don't know. I'm quite sure if
Yeah.
that would well.
I just thought it was
Mhm.
interesting watching it this time because it's like we talked about, like they both have their perspectives. Like if Ramsey doesn't act like he's the captain, like something bad could go wrong. Like, but it's my wife was saying when we're watching it too, it's like, yeah, but it's nuclear war. Like we need to
Nuclear
think about this
holocaust.
more.
Nuclear
Yeah.
holocaust.
Yeah, yeah. So everybody's affected, right? We have to at least think a little bit. And the other perspective I wanted to kind of go at is like it's a mutiny. Like number one, James, do you think that what Hunter does is that a mutiny? Him taking over the ship
Double
and releasing?
Mutiny. That's the new title of the movie.
Yeah,
Double
right.
Mutiny.
I just thought it was
Uh,
interesting because we're siding with Washington. He says, "Captain, I'm relieving you of your duty. Like you're too trigger happy. You're too excited
mhm.
about like you're not calming down, right?" But then like Zimmer confronts Wepps and is like, "We're talking a mutiny, Peter," and it's like, what whose mutiny are we talking about? Do you think that it's Hunter that's doing the mutiny, or do you think Hunter was in the right? It's such an interesting dynamic.
Right.
But and then when it comes that you have the whole thing with the submarine again, it's interesting as a character arc. I like that it gives Hunter the experience of being in war, like being able to not really triumph over that enemy submarine because they do get attacked by a torpedo, right? But it gives him that kind of experience that they keep talking about he doesn't have.
Right.
But then when it cuts to Ramsey and the Gandolfini character coming in and saying, we're in bad shape, and they start another mutiny, right? And then they put Hunter and the people that follow him, including Cobb, they put them in the mess hall, but then they escape and they do a mutiny. And so my wife was like, it's a
Triple
mutiny on top of a mutiny on top of a mutiny. And what is your opinion on this? It's like, sure, that's it. But the problem is it's dick measuring, right? Because there's that tension. They're not on the same page. Neither Ramsey or Hunter are on that same page from the beginning. There's a friction. And so it's about one-upmanship. When it comes to the part where Ramsey points his gun at Hilaire, right, the Scott Grimes character, when he's like, Officer Hilaire doesn't know the combination, and he's going to shoot him in the head to the point where Webster's like, sir, like he has to calm him down. And I thought right at that moment, I was like, that's all the proof you need. Like it's a power struggle now. It's not about that chain of command that they keep talking about. It's about who's got the biggest dick, right? It's like they're pushing each other to these moments where they've got to one up each other instead of it being about the situation. James, what do you think about that whole dynamic?
Yeah, I think you might be onto something.
It's
I think it is a little bit of that for sure. I do still think that Washington just, he's so stuck to that gun of, or his guns of, we don't know. We don't know for sure, right? Like that message got cut off. And Hackman's so sure that the message is authentic and go like that the message is that they need to fire. I mean, there's the scene after that where they would have fired, but they removed the other key. I
yeah,
mean, Hackman gets his way. They turn that key and they don't fire. And he's like, what's going on here? The other key got removed. So, I mean, that's pretty messed up. Like he actually was going to do it, but yeah, I don't know, man. It's a good dynamic, and it's just they're just so good against
well,
each other. Like it's hard to even like talk about in any terms outside of just like, man, I don't know. It's a tough situation. I
yeah,
can't imagine like what I would like. I'm trying to put myself in their shoes, or like either one of them. I mean, it's just I don't even want to,
yeah.
and I'm not going to.
Yeah.
Right. Well, the Robards character at the end says, because you didn't settle your differences, this went way out of control, right? We could have had, it's not so much that, sure, we averted disaster, but this is an embarrassment, like the way you guys handled yourselves, right? It's interesting that it's there. Johnny, what do you think about all that?
Oh, well, I was going to say, I don't know for sure, but if I had to guess, I'd probably say Denzel Washington's is bigger. That's just, but don't
That
quote
would
me
make
on that.
sense.
I don't know for sure.
Yeah.
Sorry,
What is,
Hackman.
yeah. Once you go black, you never go back. I guess. Well, also, like, I guess this leads in, James, you were talking to us about a topic you wanted to cover. What was that topic that we wanted to chat about, mutinies and sides and things like that? What did you?
Yeah. Well, I was just thinking, like, to me, kind of, people always talk about anti-war films and whatnot and how you can't have them, but I feel like this is a pretty good example of having a pretty action-packed, well, not action-packed, but feels action-packed war movie that, to me, because of all those ideas clashing, and like I said, I was just mentioning how, Hackman was turning the key. He was launching those nukes, but luckily the other guy had the key out, so they didn't launch those nukes. But it just shows the futility. You don't war bad. No, like, to me, this is serves as an anti-war film, at least on like in an emotional mental capacity, if not like, oh, an exciting war movie that people say like, oh, you're into this, so it makes war cool or whatever, quote unquote. But I think that it does still do a really good job of pushing the idea that war's bad. War's not the answer. Like, dropping nukes on people, it's not gonna help anyone. It's all gonna be bad in the end.
Death leads to more death, that kind of thing. Johnny, what do you think?
You know what I do like? I do like that even though they go through this, horrific experience and they almost launch, nuclear missiles and start World War III, at the end, they're able to come together because they've gone through that bonding experience of being at sea together and being at war and having that. They come together and they find common ground and they can joke about the horses and stuff. I like that. I like that you can kind of say, hey, you know what? We're on the same team. We're both, Americans. We're both, on the same, we're against the same enemy. So we don't have to have these differences anymore. We can come together and find common ground. And it kind of ends on that high note, and I kind of like that.
You were right, and I was wrong.
That's
about
right.
the horses.
Yes.
Horses,
right.
Well, the thing that's interesting about those Lippens on our stallions is I do, Johnny, I do like that because he says you were right and I was wrong about the horses. Like, it's like there's, we're going to have these different ideals, right? But the thing that's interesting too is if you look at, I think I read somewhere, if you look at the history of the Lippens on our stallions, like, what is it? Like, Ramsey says they're from Spain and Hunter says they're from Portugal, or maybe I'm flip-flopping that.
Yeah.
But
Something
it's
like
actually, it's wrong. Like, they're not from either. Like, they're closer to Austria, right? It's Romalia or some country. So that's where they're from. So even that's a comment on how they're neither both right or both wrong, right? It's about perspectives. And I think that's really interesting. Like you said, I like when Ramsey, he calms down. He gives, I was like shocked this time. I was like, oh, he just gives control back to Hunter. Like, after all that, he's like, Exo has the calm, right? I mean, then he walks to his, and then everything's calmed down. I was like, it almost got there, right? It almost got to the point where there's nuclear holocaust, but they were able to come to their, Ramsey has that moment where he's like, you've got 3 minutes. Like, he didn't need to give him those 3 minutes, but he did. Like, they have that moment of calm. And I just thought that moment of silence where they're there. And speaking of which, like, that Zimmer score, right? The Hans Zimmer score, this was the one I think that really like solidified him as a composer to be reckoned with, because that the Alabama theme that he has, that rousing theme, it also there's like this, and Top Gun Maverick had this too. It had this like kind of pulsating underscore that kind of underlines the tension the whole time. So even the music is adding to that tension, right? It's adding to that feel of like I'm on edge. So I think that it adds to it too. Did you have any thoughts on that Zimmer score, James?
Yeah, it's amazing. He worked with Tony a few times. He did True Romance, Days of Thunder. One of my favorite Hans Zimmer scores. That
right.
Like, that intro, whenever during the opening of Days of Thunder, whenever it's like the guitar and all that. It's one of my favorite ever. But the score is, I think Zimmer's. I may be wrong. I don't want to say anything. I think he said that that's one of maybe his favorite that he's done is the Crimson Tide score.
Yeah, I know. Speaking of Spielberg, I think that's when that got Spielberg's attention and how it helped Zimmer get the job of being the president of the music. I think at DreamWorks, like the music
Mm-hmm.
division, things like that.
Yeah,
So, yeah,
it's
again, it made
good.
an impact, and it showed up in the Independence Day trailer. I know that theme.
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah. It's one that gets tossed around for sure. Yeah, and Zimmer's
Yeah,
good at that. He's got a lot that get used. He's good. I
right,
mean,
right. Absolutely. So, was there? I'm looking over more of my notes here, but was there
oh,
anything else that you
I got
guys
some
wanted
notes.
to add to this conversation about the movie? James, there was anything else that you had, or if you're still thinking, we can go to Johnny.
No, no. I just perfect movie, man. I mean, that's a term that people throw around a lot. And this is one of those ones that's pretty close, to be in that, because everyone says, well, there's no such thing as a perfect movie, but this one gets pretty close to being perfect. I mean, it's as close as you can get almost.
Was there any other thoughts that you had or things we didn't mention, Johnny? You want to mention?
I just like the way Washington says "float the buoy." It's
What the boo.
That's
Oh,
nice.
we didn't mention how he got those shots of the sub going down, just little behind the scenes, like
oh yeah.
at the
Right.
beginning.
Well, leading into that, I thought it was interesting that if we're talking about Top Gun, like Top Gun had the Navy's full support. So it was like
Mhm.
rah rah, and like the people that enlisted was like off the charts after Top Gun. And then Tony Scott, I think he had, well, they were with me for Top Gun, they'll be with me for Crimson Tide, right? And he
Nope.
gave them the script, and they're like, "What is this? Like we can't have a mutiny, right?"
Yeah.
But what was this? What was the story with the submarine? They didn't know if they could, since they didn't have the Navy support. They didn't know if they could film that, right?
Yeah, yeah, right. The Navy, they had no Navy support, so they weren't able to get any real like footage of the Navy subs, right? So Tony Scott being Tony Scott, he was trying to like rent them and whatnot, but he couldn't rent them, because he just pulls out his checkbook and rents submarines or whatever. But so they go out to, I guess, Hawaii and figure out the sub schedules, and then rent a boat, helicopter, get some footage of a submarine going out, going underwater. I mean, and it makes for a pretty nice looking scene right there.
It did, and coincidentally, it was actually the USS Alabama, right?
Yeah, yeah,
I
it was.
can't remember.
Yeah,
I
yeah,
thought
yeah,
that was
exactly.
interesting. So the only other, and then I know that this was based on a almost a true incident, right? Like
Yeah,
there
yeah,
was
like
what did I have? There was a Russian ship the during the Cuban Missile Crisis, the submarine B-59, like there was a captain that thought like they were trying to avoid like the blockade, and so the submarine
mhm.
ducked underneath, and they lost contact with Moscow. And because the U.S. was dropping these depth charges, like the captain of the Russian boat thought for sure that the war had broken out, and his political officer agreed with them. But then his second in command was like, "No, we have to think about this," like, and didn't agree. Like, I don't agree with your findings, and we all have to agree. And convinced him to surface, and they were surrounded by the U.S. military and got back into contact with Moscow, right? And Moscow said, stand down, come back. And they avoided nuclear war. I thought that was interesting.
Yeah,
I think it's funny that when you ask the Navy if there's ever been a mutiny on board one of their ships, they're like, never. We would never do that. And it's like, really? Like,
yeah.
really?
You're just not telling us.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. And so, and the other thing I want to add, like a couple of things, I thought it was funny how, we have the Star Trek reference, but then in Unstoppable, Denzel Washington starred against Captain Kirk. I thought that was really funny. Or we
Yeah,
can't
yeah,
go without mentioning the Danny Nucci character. I really liked his
yeah.
character
Danny Nucci, Nooch.
in this
Yeah, he's
movie,
good.
as opposed to what is it, the Fabricio?
Yeah,
I'm going to America, that kind of thing.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
But he's funny. Like he's the one, like with the Silver Surfer conversation. I like when Hunter confronts him. Right, Rivetti is his name, and he's like, we both like, even if stupidity comes in, we both know that the Kirby Silver Surfer is the only true Silver Surfer. And Nietzsche has a line reading where he goes, like he starts laughing. He's like, yes, like he understands the situation. Or I like later when like it's during the tense situation in the submarine, and they're talking about why they can't arm the missiles, right? And one guy goes, "It's only 1,000 yards. Like, why can't we arm the thing?" And Rivetti goes, "Because it needs 1,000 yards to arm. For crying out loud, who'd you have to screw to get on the ship?" That was really funny. Or the part of the end when they have the Mexican standoff again, Tarantinoism, when they're pointing their guns, is like, "Stop or I'll shoot," and he can't do it. Like oh shit, like he can't shoot. I thought he was kind of the scene stealer of the movie. He had a really really good part.
That's what Tony Scott is in the Mexican standoff. He's got
Yeah,
True
Domino showed up
Romance,
in, right?
Domino,
Enemy of the State.
Yeah, yeah,
Very
he likes them.
Tarantino. You said it was a perfect movie, James. Johnny, did you have any final thoughts on why this movie's worth remembering?
Well, like James, said, everything comes together. The script is phenomenal. The acting is phenomenal. I think Tony Scott did a great job. He knew what to do for each scene, and he let that tension build throughout. And it's just like I said in the beginning, it keeps you on the edge of your seat, and it did me the entire time. And if you haven't seen it, I would definitely recommend it. It's definitely a good movie.
Yeah, as an acting showcase, as a masterclass in tension ratcheting, I think Crimson Tide is one of the best entertainments of the '90s, and it's the best, in my opinion, the best Tony Scott movie because it's unhindered by a lot of his, the style that can kind of overtake that. It's fascinating looking at this guy's filmography because, like we talked about, it's not always one thing from the next thing. He's always trying out different techniques. I guess as a final word for you, James, as far as Tony Scott goes, why should we like Tony Scott? Why is Tony Scott such why is he your second, sometimes first favorite filmmaker?
Sometimes first, yeah, that's good. For those reasons, and for the reasons I said earlier too, like maybe to the detriment of some of the movies in the later stage of his career. He was always wanting to one up himself. He wanted to try more and more and more and more, and maybe it didn't always need it. And who can really say for sure? But those are all the reasons that I think he's worth appreciating and worth everyone checking out his whole filmography. Because he does have such a unique style, but especially stylistically, visually. In the latter half of his career, it's unmistakable. Kind of, I feel like he kind of hit his sweet spot and realized what worked and what didn't work from doing all that stuff in the 2000s. I mean, sadly, of course, he took his own life before he could do any more.
There's all this debate about why he killed himself, and I think it's his family knows, and that's all that really matters, right? It's like we don't need to. I don't know if we need to delve into.
It doesn't matter. It's like
it's not our business, right?
People have rumors, blah blah blah. No one knows, and doesn't help anyone to try to figure it out because bottom line, he's gone.
Yeah, there's a lot of. He could have done he was always evolving, and so there could have been so much more from him. I think that's the real kind of the tragedy there. So yeah, again, Crimson Tide, great movie. If you haven't seen it, see it, and if you haven't seen it in a while, watch it again. I think we all kind of appreciated it more this time. It grows on you, and it's lasted. So again, James, thanks for coming on. This conversation has been building for quite a while. Like we've been friends on Twitter for quite a bit. Yeah, I reached out to you about Crimson Tide early last year, and so
I was going to say it might be over a year at this point. I didn't look back, but it's been a while.
At least it's been a while, and then it was like, oh my gosh, we still need to talk to James. I got to get him in here.
Yeah,
I want to think I lost contact with him.
I mean, part of me, I'm not gonna lie, part of me was like, oh man, do I really want to talk about Tony Scott again? Because like I said, it's just fun. I almost feel like I gotta kind of break free of this.
Yeah,
I watch other stuff too. I'm not just the Tony Scott guy, but I'm a regular person too.
Well, like I said,
you're a drummer too, right?
Yeah. There you go. We talked about that. Well,
but yes, I'm glad to talk about Tony Scott, obviously, because like you said, there are still a lot of people who maybe don't, give him a chance or haven't even discovered his work yet. And so I'm definitely gonna keep pushing it out there because it deserves it.
Okay. Well, again, thank you so much for coming on and finally having this conversation and bringing, like I said, that fountain of positivity. We need that every now and then.
Yeah, man. That's all I want. That's the thing, right? We know, yes, there is definitely a great positive whenever you do meet like-minded folks and you can just talk about movies, and it's just like hanging out with friends, just shooting shit.
Well, again, if people wanted to find those positive takes and those conversation starters, how would they find you on Twitter? What's your handle there?
My handle is hard to it's TJ _ Mackey. So TJ Mackey, Frank TJ Mackey from Magnolia, 432. So TJ _ Mackey 432. That's my Twitter handle because Magnolia is one of my favorite movies. There's another side of me you don't learn right now.
Well, it's still a 90s movie.
Yeah, it is.
We'll bring you back on for some Paul Thomas Anderson talk.
Yeah, I do like me some Paul Thomas Anderson. I have a Paul Thomas Anderson hoodie.
Oh,
he's
really?
up there in my Tough.
Wow, not only a fountain of positivity, a fountain of new information.
Yes.
All right. Well, James, we appreciate you. And again, we're glad to have you back on. Looking forward to more conversations in the future.
Sure. Yeah. Let me know.
Yeah. Thank you for being you. We appreciate you.
All right. Good to meet you too. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Tension on deck. Von Clausewitz will now tell us exactly who the real enemy is. Von?
In my humble opinion, in the nuclear world, the true enemy is war itself.
All right, welcome back. Again, we want to thank Mr. James Coddington for joining us for that. Wow, that was a fun conversation, wasn't it? Crimson Tide. I think you mentioned that you were amazed, like, oh yeah, I forgot how good this movie was, right?
Yeah.
And just sitting and watching it, just being enraptured again. And wow, that's the kind of thing that we look for, I think, during the 90s. Like when we watched, being so heavily into drama and around that time and acting being in plays, when we watched a movie that had that caliber of acting in it, I think that really struck a chord with us.
Yeah.
That's the reason why A Few Good Men struck a chord with us. That's the reason why something like, I don't know, Mr. Holland's Opus struck a chord with us. Just these great performances. I think we really responded to those things. And I don't know, like this could be Hackman and Washington's career best performances. Is that something that you remember responding to, was the acting in certain movies?
I mean, yes, mainly because I was studying acting, and so I was trying to study the greats, you know what I mean, and trying to learn their technique and everything. But yeah, I mean, this movie, Gene Hackman and Denzel Washington, just awesome performances. You can't go wrong with this movie and their performances.
Right. So definitely great. And so, typical thing I wanted to do, let's just do top 3 Tony Scott movies. We talked a lot about it in the episode, and James mentioned a few. I know for a fact that we didn't talk about a couple of these, so I did want to mention some Tony Scottisms. But if we wanted to go through our, top 1, 2, 3 kind of thing, we'll just get out of the way. For me, Crimson Tide, we already talked about it, right? It's the colors and the angles and the Hans Zimmer music, obviously. It's all of the piece, like I said, with being, you feel like you're on that submarine, right? So it's not just style for style's sake, which again is a criticism of Tony Scott a good deal of the time, who's a music video director and has a lot of the flashy stuff and things like that. So Crimson Tide is one where I think it doesn't change his style, but it hones it and really applies to the material at hand. It's a perfect match of material and directing style. So that's obviously my number 1.
Okay. My number 1 is True Romance, and I think that one mainly because it's probably my favorite of his movies to watch. Might not be his best, but it's my favorite to watch. Like I am entertained for the whole thing, and maybe because it's a Tarantino script, but it's just got all the different elements that I really look for in a movie. And like you said, it all comes together, and I love True Romance. I think it's a great film.
Yeah. We never know. We might come back and talk about True Romance, even though we've talked about Tarantino quite a bit. I don't want to seem like I'm nitpicking your choice, because True Romance was, when I saw True Romance in the theater, that was my first Tarantino experience. Like, why are they talking about comic books? Why are they talking about other movies? Why is there this scene between Dennis Hopper and Christopher Walken that's literally just 2 guys sitting talking with each other, and it's so tense and it's so fun and it's so violent and surprising? It's like, it was an experience for me, right? I think my only issue, and maybe I've got 2 issues with True Romance, is if you've ever read the original script by Tarantino, it's very Tarantino-esque. It's very out of order and not chronological.
And doesn't he die in the end? Like, Christian Slater's character dies, right?
Yeah, Clarence dies, and then later in Reservoir Dogs, they mention Alabama. So she kind of becomes like a mob. That was the arc that she had. But when they were making the movie, and again, it's kind of what you want, right? You want a director to come in and make it his own. And that's what Tony Scott did, not just with the looks, but he was able to look at Clarence and Alabama and say, these 2 are like a fairy tale couple. We want them to end up together. And so that's why they lived, and it's a happy ending. So, but I don't know, like, I like the structure of the original script. Making it more linear kind of takes some of the joy out of it, even though, like I said, you've got a bunch of scenes like the walk-in Hopper scene that just pockets of pure joy. The only other thing that I kind of grade against is the Tony Scott style elevating the already elevated Tarantino style. You know what I mean? You got these heightened characters, heightened dialogue. So when you have violence, it seems like I equate it to like going to a nightclub and you already have a headache and you're there and there's already music and then somebody comes up and just starts yelling in your ear, right? It's like, all right, I get it. Like tone it down a little bit. I just think that I like Tarantino. If there's a case that can be made, I think Tarantino should be the one to direct his own scripts. You could also say that about Shane Black, where he will get it better than most other directors will get it. So, like I said, even though I do love True Romance, I just think that's my only criticism of it. It's just a little too much style on top of what's already stylish. If that makes sense.
I can see that, but I think that's why I like it.
Yeah, and I agree with you. It's definitely super fun to watch. So no qualms there. So the second movie I'm going to pick, and it's not. I pick it because it's interesting. I pick it because it's not just brush it off. It's not just style for style. Well, there's a lot of style for style's sake, and there's some of the stylistic choices I don't understand because it kind of grates against what the movie's saying. But I'm going to pick Man on Fire as my second Tony Scott choice. Again, funny picking a Denzel Washington movie. Maybe they're a match made in heaven. I just like the idea that it's this Creasy character. This he was a former like spy, and he's a CIA agent, right? And he just had war torn places. Like it just has damaged him to the point where at the beginning he's trying to commit suicide. So he's not a safe person. He's not like mentally stable. The Creasy character to start off with. So when he starts bonding with this Dakota Fanning character and just taking some responsibility over it. And then she's kidnapped in Mexico City or whatever, because that's the lengths that he goes to, because he finally found some sanity, right, with this little girl. And the fact that she's taken by violent criminals, something in him, it breaks him. And so he becomes like a vigilante. And it makes you, when you're watching it makes you question how far you'll go, or if you would want somebody that would go to those lengths to get your family back. You know what I mean? And so a lot of the violence and the torture sequences, there's a part where he's got one of these supposed kidnappers in a car, and it's baking sunlight, and he's got the guy like handcuffed to the steering wheel, and he starts cutting the guy's fingers off one at a time, right? And you question it because part of you wants that. A part of you wants this guy to suffer, but the other part is like, I don't want, like, why are we going to these lengths? Like, he's cutting off body parts here. Like, what, how far could we take this kind of thing, right? And even though in that scene, I remember watching the movie going, boy, imagine if this was Creasy's daughter. What would he have done if this was his own daughter? I just think that it's the lengths that the character goes to, and Denzel Washington plays that just so, like, the unstable kind of part of that aspect of the character. I just think it's very good. It's like I said, it's very derivative. There's a lot of style. Like, you see text pop up a lot of the time while people are speaking, and I don't understand what's going on and why Tony Scott's doing that. And he took it to more extremes in I think Domino is like the ultimate, like, whoa, over sensory experience. Man of Fire kind of almost gets there. So there's a lot of questionable choices, but I think the underlying theme and the way that it's just, you know what I mean? It's conflicting when you're watching it, and I think that's fascinating because it's not just an easy watch. It makes you think, it makes you apply. And so, even though it's not, like you said with True Romance, it's not maybe his best, I just think it's got a lot on its mind. It's just interesting. Have you seen Man on Fire?
Yes, I've seen it once. I'll have to watch it again because I don't remember much what you're talking about, but I have seen it once. And for some reason, I don't remember it being very impactful to me, but I'm sure if I watch it again, I might see what you're talking about.
Right.
But I have seen it though.
Okay. All right.
My number two is Crimson Tide, and I don't want to rehash it, but yeah, great movie, great direction, great acting. It all comes together. Great movie.
Okay. All right. Perfect. Yeah, we don't need to go into a whole another hour talking about Crimson Tide. So, all right. So my number three. So I kind of debated. I wanted to, like I mentioned, Shane Black. I wanted to talk about The Last Boy Scout, maybe. But
Okay.
I call that like one of my guiltiest of all pleasure movies. I don't know if it's good. I like a lot of the dialogue, and it's very funny. But I don't think that it's quite as good as Kiss Kiss Bang Bang or The Nice Guys, because, like I said, I think Richard Donner kind of got Shane Black. Shane Black is a very idiosyncratic kind of writer, and Tony Scott has a lot, like the Bruce Willis, Damon Wayans byplay is really fun, but I just enjoy other Shane Black movies a little bit more than that one. So it's weird. I'm going to pick another Denzel Washington. I'm going to go with Deja Vu. And
Okay.
I just think it's so fun. It's such an like it's a time travel movie. It's a cop thriller. It's it's a bunch of different things. It's got again Val Kilmer in one of his last rascally performances. We know we've talked about Val Kilmer before in our Willow episode. But yeah, there's a sequence where they have this like camera that can look into the past, and so Denzel like he dons this like helmet as he's driving a Humvee, and he's able to see and track a killer like a couple days before, and kind of retrack his footsteps or his path, and it's just a really fun, interesting, imaginative action sequence, and I like the idea of Denzel going back in time and falling in love with the Paula Patton character as Jim Caviezel as the bad guy, and so it's able to do a lot of good time travel stuff. It's a fun. If you haven't seen Deja Vu, it's really interesting. Like I said, with Tony Scott, I don't know if there's a lot of me personally. I don't know if it's like quality, um, um, class A or grade A type movie. It's more like B movie stuff or even C movie stuff that's kind of given that Tony Scott style. I don't know. What do you think of Deja Vu?
I don't know. I wouldn't say that he's like a B or C class director. I think he's A-list director.
Oh,
I
I
think.
mean, not just that. I mean, he's taking B material or C material
Oh,
and he's elevating it. You know
oh,
what I
okay,
mean? I just
okay.
the
I
material that
get
he's
that.
tackling. Yeah, yeah.
Mhm.
Like I said, Deja Vu's derivative, Man on Fire's derivative, and a little uncomfortable. And so he's taking this material and kind of giving it an interesting spin. I don't know
Mhm.
if it's like I said, if it's grade A material that he's working with, but yeah. Did
Okay.
you?
Again, I have seen Deja Vu, but only once, and I'm not really that familiar with it, so I'll have to watch it again to know all the things you're talking about. But
Right, right.
again, I have seen it, but
Okay.
I didn't really go into a deep dive into it.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I've seen. Maybe you have to see it 2 or 3 times, but I just think it's just really fun watch.
But my third pick is a movie I have seen over and over again, and that's Enemy of the State.
Ah,
And I love this movie. I mean, again, I like these kind of political, uh, side to these movies like these. Like kind of has a political aspect to it. So does
yeah,
this
yeah,
one. And I like the color scheme they put together with it. I like all the it's just the idea of the whole Big Brother and they can like just destroy your life in a second if they want to. That's
yeah.
was kind of like that's scary to me because if that can happen, then we're all in trouble. So, and also great performances by Gene Hackman again, and Will Smith was fine, but could have been Denzel. Would have been a better movie if it was Denzel.
Yeah, it's Will Smith being Will Smith, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, that is fun. The kind of topical. The thing that I love about Enemy of the State is that the Conversation, the Coppola movie with Hackman, is one of my favorite all time movies. And the character that Hackman plays in that, Harry Call, this could be him. Like they don't like tell you it's not him. This could be that same character, and this is what he's become because the end of the conversation, he's this paranoid kind of lunatic at the end of that movie, and so this could literally be him like decades later. I think that's a kind of a fascinating idea that they kind of play with. And yeah, it can get kind of hokey with like, oh, they've got their ears and everything except for when Will Smith kidnaps or takes his neighbor's car. Like, why wouldn't have they've gone to so much length? Why wouldn't they bug his neighbor's car? He's able to do that. But so it's got a lot of like, yeah, I don't know about that, but it is fun, and it is, like you said, it's interesting that it kind of plays with our current situation and everything. So yeah, that's a good fun movie. Good choices.
All right.
But yeah, Tony Scott, like we talked about in the episode, I don't mean to. He's got a style to him, right? Like Top Gun. It's weird to think that Top Gun was like his second movie when you could already tell that this is a Tony Scott movie. You know what I mean? Even though it's got the Bruckheimer Simpson stamp on it, I think he's definitely missed. Like there was no reason for him to. I don't know. Like he still had so much left in him. I know that Unstoppable is another good Denzel Washington movie that would have been fun to talk about. A good like Speed. It's a good propulsive kind of stripped down story. That's not, so he had a lot of good work in him. Like when he really focused and decided to tell a story instead of letting the style overcome everything. I think, like you said, he's a grade A director. You know what I mean? So I don't mean to when we criticize people, when we criticize movies, that's not to say that these are terrible things, right? It's just things that we see and things that could be better and have been better in their filmography. So yeah, definitely miss Tony Scott. So let's put Crimson Tide behind us, and what movie are we going to discuss next?
Okay, well, I invited a guest on, and this is going to be a returning guest. He joined us for our Goonies episode, and that's
Uh,
Dave Nugent. So
all
he's going to
right.
come back. And
Huge.
he chose a movie that's kind of personal to him, and we'll probably discuss that on the episode. But he chose Mrs. Doubtfire.
Oh,
So yeah,
okay.
that's
More Robin Williams, right? We
yeah.
Popeye was the last time we talked about Robin Williams, right?
Well, we talked about him a little bit during our Swing Kids and Dead
Oh,
Poets
right,
Society.
right, right.
And,
Okay. Well, yeah, that'll be fun because that was a big hit. Chris Columbus, right? He had like Home Alone, then he had Home Alone 2, and then he had this one. Wow. That's kind of a good run. So yeah. Oh, it'll be fun to talk to Dave again. That was how long ago was the Goonies? That was
I want to say it
years.
was 2017.
Whoa.
We recorded that episode.
6 years. Does he still have his beard?
I don't know. We'll have to find out.
All right. Yeah, that sounds awesome. Okay. All right. Well, yeah. So we'll talk about Mrs. Doubtfire next time. But until then, I'm Darren Lundberg,
And I'm Johnny Craddock.
and I'm the commander of the ship.
Float the buoy.
All right. All right. We'll catch you later, guys. Bye.